Good evening. The president has arrived back in Washington tonight, facing the latest storm over the newest item on a long and growing list of statements and actions in the Russia investigation that could land him in serious legal trouble. The president calls the latest item fake news, calls the probe a witch hunt, and attacks the professionals and agencies conducting it. And even before last night's bombshell about his effort to fire Mueller, President Trump earlier this week mocked the idea that any of his actions so far could be legally problematic.
Now they're saying, oh, well, did he fight back? If you fight back, you say obstruction. Sir, you fight back, John. You fight back. Oh, it's obstruction.
Well, keeping him honest, because this is exactly what Robert Mueller could be considering. We begin tonight with a kind of timeline of what the president may call fighting back, but others may consider attempts at obstruction of justice. And though it certainly is long and might be exhausting, it is by no means exhaustive. Item 1, January 27th of last year, then FBI Director James Comey had dinner with the president. In his statement for the record to the Senate Intelligence Committee, he said the president first asked him if he wanted to stay on as FBI director, then said, "I need loyalty. I expect loyalty."
Had you ever had any of those kind of requests before from anyone else you'd worked for in the government?
No. And what made me uneasy was I'm, at that point, the director of the FBI. The reason that Congress created a 10-year term is so that the director is not feeling as if they're serving with political loyalty owed to any particular person.
So is that an attempt to obstruct justice? Remember, just a week earlier, the New York Times had broken the news that U.S. law enforcement and intelligence agencies were conducting a counterintelligence investigation into links between Trump associates and Russia. Was that on the president's mind when he demanded loyalty from Director Comey? February 13th, National Security Advisor Michael Flynn is forced out. According to the White House, at the time, it was for lying to the vice president about ties to Russia. That, of course, was not entirely true. He's since pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. The next day, February 14th, at a counterterrorism briefing in the Oval Office, the president sends everyone out of the room except for Director Comey. Then Comey says the president tells him this about Flynn, quote, "He's a good guy and has been through a lot. I hope you can see your way clear to letting this go, to letting Flynn go," end quote. He later elaborated to the Intelligence Committee.
And as I said in my statement, I could be wrong, but Flynn had been forced to resign the day before. And the controversy around General Flynn at that point in time was centered on whether he had lied to the vice president about the nature of his conversations with the Russians, whether he had been candid with others in the course of that. And so that happens on the day before. On the 14th, the president makes specific reference to that. And so that's why I understood him to be saying that what he wanted me to do was drop any investigation connected to Flynn's account of his conversations with the Russians.
So was that statement by the president to Comey an attempt by the president to obstruct justice? On March 2nd, Attorney General Sessions recuses himself. The president has been writing and publicly deriding him ever since. On March 22nd, according to the Washington Post, the president lobbies a top intelligence official to intervene with Director Comey to stop investigating Flynn. Was that an attempt to obstruct justice? May 9th, the president fires Comey, citing as the reason his handling of the Clinton email investigation. Was that an attempt to obstruct justice? The very next day, May 10th, in a meeting only captured by a Russian camera, the president boasts to Russia's foreign minister and the ever-present ambassador Kislyak, quote, "I just fired the head of the FBI. He was crazy, a real nut job. I face great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. I'm not under investigation." That's according to the New York Times. Firing Comey took the pressure off. And as if to dispel any doubt that Russia at very least factored into the president's motivation for firing James Comey, the president said so out loud the very next day to NBC's Lester Holt.
Regardless of recommendation, I was going to fire Comey, knowing there was no good time to do it. And in fact, when I decided to just do it, I said to myself, I said, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats for having lost an election that they should have won.
The day after that, the president, obviously on a roll, sent this tweet, quote, "James Comey better hope that there are no tapes of our conversations before he starts leaking to the press." Hollow though it was, there were no tapes. The question is, was the president trying to intimidate a future witness? And is that an attempt to obstruct justice? At the time, Press Secretary Sean Spicer denied it, saying that's not a threat. He simply stated a fact. Still unclear what fact Mr. Spicer is referring to there because, again, there were no tapes. On May 17th, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein appoints Robert Mueller special counsel, and the president begins tweeting that this is the single greatest witch hunt in American political history. He goes on to tweet attacks on Rosenstein, Attorney General Sessions, Comey, Mueller, the FBI, which he says at one point is in tatters, the intelligence community, deep state, and others, all of which continues to this day. Also, according to a source familiar with the matter, the president later pressured Attorney General Sessions to push Comey's replacement, Christopher Wray, to clean house at the Bureau, specifically to fire Andrew McCabe. That is jumping ahead. We go back to the timeline. On June 12th, Trump friend Christopher Ruddy went on the PBS NewsHour and dropped this bombshell.
I think he's considering perhaps terminating the special counsel. I think he's weighing that option. I think it's pretty clear by what one of his lawyers said on television recently. I personally think it would be a very significant mistake.
Well, we've since learned that the president did more than just consider it. He ordered it only to back down at the last minute. Was that an attempt to obstruct justice? At the very least, the president and his people have for months been less than honest about this, including right at the very moment it actually was happening.
While the president has the right to, he has no intention to do so.
The president has not even discussed that. The president is not discussing firing Bob Mueller.
But will he commit not to fire?
We are complying and cooperating with. He has not even discussed not fire. He's not discussed firing Bob Mueller.
I haven't given it any thought. I mean, I've been reading about it from you people. You say, oh, I'm going to dismiss him. No, I'm not dismissing anybody.
Are you considering firing Robert Mueller?
No, not at all.
Is there any chance at all that the president will try to fire Robert Mueller?
No, I saw a couple of people talking about this morning, and the answer to that is no.
Do you still be integrity firing?
No, I'm not. No.
Well, we now know, according to multiple news outlets, that this simply is not true. So now take a look at this. These are most of the incidents I just mentioned. And I'll ask again, are any of these an attempt to obstruct justice? Is the sum total an indication of an attempt by the president to obstruct justice? It's a question Robert Mueller will decide soon enough. As we said, the president is just now back in D.C. with the controversy swirling in and out of his White House. And that's where we find our Pam Brown. Pam, the president's landed. It was a long plane ride back from Davos. Did he or any of the White House staff talk about the plan to fire Mueller?
They did not. In fact, the president was asked questions when he got off Marine One. He only would say that his trip to Davos was a great trip, a successful trip. He did not address the bombshell revelations that he directed White House counsel Don McGahn to fire Mueller, and that McGahn had threatened to quit back in June. Although the White House is really letting his other comments stand that he made in Davos. He claimed that these revelations, this news is fake news, which is what we've heard before, saying that the Russia investigation is a hoax. Other than that, the White House has been mum. There has not been a public denial from White House counsel Don McGahn. And given that and given the news, you have to wonder what the future meetings will be like between the president and his White House counsel. We're told by sources that up until this point, that Don McGahn wanted to stay in his role, that he was happy in his role. But you can imagine this could set up for some awkward meetings. In terms of the mood, the reaction to this in the White House, people I've spoken with say that there was a sense of surprise by the revelation, that they knew this past June was a period of an intense time. There was a lot of anxiety going on. As one source said, it was really touch and go. But certainly a lot of them didn't realize the extent to which this tension boiled over with Don McGahn, White House counsel, apparently, according to sources, threatening to resign from this order from Robert Mueller. Now, the question next, how will this impact the negotiations going on right now between the president's lawyers and Robert Mueller's team? One source told me, of course, the fact that he ordered Don McGahn to fire Robert Mueller could be an extra layer of inquiry in the obstruction of justice case. Those negotiations and whether the president will sit down and talk to Robert Mueller still ongoing at this hour. Anderson?
Pam Brown, thanks very much. Joining us now is New Jersey Democratic Senator Cory Booker, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator Booker, President Trump ordering Mueller to be fired, taken together with everything else we know so far, to you, does it rise to the level of obstruction of justice?
Well, to me, it's a very troubling fact pattern. And we see this president who has, in my opinion, very authoritarian tendencies that upset, really actually more than upset, that destroy the norms of our democracy and do border on things that I think could arise to the attention, or actually I know are arising to the attention of the special prosecutor. Remember, this is somebody who, as you said through that long fact pattern, has made it his business to seem to try to intimidate or punish people, whether it's Jeff Sessions for recusing himself, whether it's Robert Mueller himself. So we have a very serious situation with this president that ultimately I think is unchecked right now and doesn't see himself as being subject to the rule of law. I mean, he's even going as far, like dictators in other nations, to call for the arrest and persecution and prosecution of his former opponent. So we're in troubling times here, and I've been advocating in the Senate, along with Lindsey Graham, to try to do some very basic, pragmatic, bipartisan things to provide more checks and balances to a president that has authoritarian tendencies.
You know, the president just the other day said, well, look, he described what he was doing as fighting back. You're saying it goes beyond fighting back.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, if he says, if he means what he says, that he's done nothing wrong, that he hasn't colluded with the Russians, that he hasn't in any way been involved, he should do what he said when he was Citizen Trump to others. If you have nothing to hide, then just let the investigation run its course, cooperate with the investigation, submit to interviews, and let this move on. In many ways, he seems to be acting as if somebody who has something to hide and trying to use power in a way that really does pervert American norms and traditions and could possibly end up being criminal acts.
You know, a number of the president's allies are saying, well, look, regarding the idea of firing Mueller, nothing happened. That McGahn didn't actually fire Mueller, and that McGahn putting his foot down actually shows that the checks within the executive branch are functioning properly.
Well, I think if this is what that means, just think about where we are in the United States of America. We are, a lot of people now just seem to think, hey, it's really good that we have a few people in the White House that are protecting us, the American people, from the president's tendencies, from his inclinations, from his passions. That's a very scary thing when it comes to all of the issues that he has to deal with, where his impulses seem to be so dangerous, contrary to American norms, destructive of our ultimate interests in a functioning democracy. And so if the only thing separating this president from disastrous outcomes is the courage, occasional courage of people in his circles who have to literally threaten him with leaving, threaten him with resigning, that to me doesn't seem like a very good situation. In fact, it's something that to me is tantamount to a potential crisis in the future. And again, that's why Congress, I believe, needs to be taking very pragmatic steps as a point of not just pragmatism, but moral urgency to make sure that we have the right constitutional protections in place should this president ever cross the line.
You were referencing this before, this bill that you and Senator Lindsey Graham proposed last August to protect Special Counsel Mueller from being fired by the president. Where does that stand now?
Well, I'm actually really encouraged that Lindsey Graham and I partnered on this, that Chuck Grassley, the Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee, granted it a hearing. Many bills I think are worthy of hearings don't get this, but he thought enough to give it a hearing. And so I'm hoping that after this crisis, it's Friday now, people have left, but when people get back, that we're going to find some more momentum to actually getting this bill passed, not only for this moment in time, but just think about, we have a nation's law set up so that a president who is in power, who is under investigation by a special prosecutor, can order the firing of that special prosecutor without that much accountability whatsoever. To ask the judiciary branch to provide a check on that power so it doesn't become authoritarian, to me that's very sensible to do. And I think it's something we should do for now, for this case scenario, and for into the future.
You mentioned Grassley and Lindsey Graham. Have you spoken to your Republican colleagues? I mean, is there an appetite on both sides of the aisle to push legislation like yours forward?
Well, clearly there's been an appetite to co-author that legislation with Lindsey Graham, with giving it a hearing, and I'm hoping there's an appetite now for passing it. Especially, again, my colleagues, whether what side of your aisle on, we all see the same fact pattern. We all see the same behavior on the part of our president. And I think people have a lot of concern. And I'm sure you've heard it, Anderson, when you talk to senators on both sides of the aisle, how happy they are that Secretary of Defense Mattis is in there, that there's these adults in the room that are around him to control him from these impulses. Well, that's That's not enough. What we need is the rule of law. We need checks and balances. We need to make sure that our republic, in and of itself, as we stand, can withstand a president with the kind of inclinations that he's showing.
Senator Cory Booker, appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Coming up next, new reporting on the president's mood, where his Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein is concerned, as well as our legal team's take on the obstruction question. And later, call it the First Lady vanishes, where she went instead of accompanying the president overseas just days after their wedding anniversary. New insight on that ahead on 360.
You think I'm crazy?
A monster unleashed.
Oh my God.
A man obsessed.
He's watching us.
A city in fear. Mondays on TNT, the hunt for pure evil begins.
Cold-blooded killers walk among us.
Based on the best-selling novel, Daniel Bruhl, Luke Evans, and Dakota Fanning.
What compels a man to do evil?
The Alienist, new limited series Mondays at 9/8 Central on TNT.
Breaking news on the reaction in Washington tonight. On top of the reporting on how close the president came to firing Robert Mueller, there's new reporting on how annoyed, or perhaps it's better to say how much more annoyed the president is with one key justice official. CNN's Sarah Murray has that new reporting. So I understand the president has been aiming his ire at Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein.
That's right. What we have heard from 4 different sources is that the president has grown frustrated with Rod Rosenstein. He's airing these frustrations. 2 sources actually told us that the president at times has even spoken about wanting to fire the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. Now, some of these sources said, look, this seems like bluster. This seems like the president airing his frustrations. We don't really believe he's going to follow through on this, but it gives you an indication of just how preoccupied the president still is by this Russia probe and all these different avenues he's tried to taken to sort of bring an end to it. Obviously, we know he fired James Comey. We know he remains frustrated that Attorney General Jeff Sessions recused himself. We saw the reporting about how he dealt with Mueller and considering firing him. And now it seems like Rod Rosenstein has sort of gotten caught up in that as well and is in the president's crosshairs.
Sir Murray, thanks very much. Perspective now from CNN Chief Legal Analyst Jeffrey Toobin and George Washington University Law Professor Jonathan Turley. So, Jeff, first of all, on Rosenstein, regardless how angry the president is at Rosenstein, what can he actually do? I mean, sure, legally he could fire him, but what would be the political fallout from that?
Well, I don't think the president cares that much about the political fallout. I mean, he wouldn't have fired the FBI director if he cared about that. I mean, just pause and think about how many people he's already fired in his own administration.
And doesn't like already.
And he's talked about firing Jeff Sessions. Now the deputy, Rod Rosenstein, he's supposedly mad at the chief of staff, General Kelly. He's mad at Don McGahn, the White House counsel. I mean, I think at some point, you have to look at the management rather than the fact that, and he's already, gotten rid of half of the White House staff one go round. I mean, I think that's the news more than anything Rod Rosenstein did.
Let's talk about the Mueller thing with Jeff. I mean, regarding any possible obstruction of justice case that Mueller might pursue, he would have to prove corrupt intent. What is corrupt intent, and what's the bar that has to be met in order to prove it?
Well, corrupt intent means sort of bad intent. There's no sort of it's not a technicality. It's legal technicality. It's just improper intent. The president is allowed to fire the FBI director as he did, and he could have set in motion the firing of Robert Mueller. But it is obstruction of justice if you do it with corrupt intent. And I think what's so important about the New York Times story yesterday is you see that Donald McGahn, the White House's own lawyer, thought that the president's intent was wrong and improper. The reasons he gave, the 3 bogus reasons that he gave for wanting to fire Mueller, suggests that you really could find an improper intent here, and that the evidence of obstruction of justice is, I think, getting stronger after this story.
Professor Turley, do you agree with Jeff on this?
Well, only to a point. I'm afraid I don't agree with his conclusion. Trump can argue that there's another reason for why he wanted to fire Mueller. Mueller did have a conflict of interest. I was very critical of Mueller's appointment. He's a witness to his own investigation. He interviewed for Comey's job. That's the one that I think is a serious problem.
Why even though I supported
even though I supported the special counsel being investigation, because, you're not supposed to be a witness in an investigation that you're conducting. He interviewed for that job. He met with the president soon after the termination of Comey. You can throw a stick on any corner and hit 100 lawyers in D.C. Why they had to put this one there, I think, was a mistake. But that doesn't mean that he should be fired. It also doesn't mean that the president should be given credit for not firing him. You can't really argue that you didn't start a fire when someone else blew out the match. And if this report is correct, the president was about to do a remarkably self-defeating act, and one that I think would be grossly inappropriate. But I don't think it makes a case for obstruction. I think people constantly look at each of these changes and say, well, there it is. There's the piece we're looking for. And he has defenses.
Well, I think Jonathan sort of made my point, which is you look at so many different acts that the president has done, whether it's telling James Comey to be loyal, whether it's telling him to go easy on his national security advisor, whether it's firing James Comey, whether it's trying to find Robert Mueller. Yes, perhaps it's true that each one of those individually is not a criminal act. But when you take them all together, you do see a pattern of improper motives, using the power of the presidency to for improper purposes. This was why impeachment proceedings began against Richard Nixon. This was why, in part, Bill Clinton was impeached. This is an abuse of power that the impeachment process has traditionally been used to police.
Well, I think where we disagree, Anderson, is that there is another explanation. If you look at outside this investigation, the president conducts himself much in the same way. He often goes boldly where wiser men would not tread. He often tries to manage issues. He often speaks directly how he's feeling. This is not that different from how he deals with other areas. And so the assumption that each of these acts has a criminal intent ignores the fact that it's consistent with his conduct outside the investigation.
Well, I don't think, there's no provision in the law for, you get an excuse because you have a big personality. I mean,
No, but there's no provision that's...
But if you fire the FBI director for an improper purpose, I don't care that you sometimes fly off the handle or that this is an act that is potentially, at least, a violation of the law.
But, Jeffrey, you and I think, agree. I thought it was a terrible mistake to fire James Comey. But there is a perfect alternative reason, right? Many people had called for him to be fired, and Rod Rosenstein had his memo, which was not the reason for his termination, but listed all the people on both sides, Democrat and Republican, including attorneys general, who said that he should go. Now, you're assuming that, look, that might be a good reason, but it's not the reason I think he had in his head. I don't think that's a very strong criminal case.
We're going to have to leave it there. Jeff Toobin, Professor Jonathan Turley, thank you very much. Ahead,
thank you.
For a lot of Americans, President Trump's threat to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller last summer brought back memories of another president, another special counsel, and another time it became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. We'll talk with several former Nixon aides who were there, get their take on why and how it matters today.
Hey there, it's Alicia Malone. I'm the host of the Filmstruck podcast, a show made by film lovers for film lovers. We have great conversations with people working behind the scenes in Hollywood movies, like Liz Hannah and Josh Singer. This is an incredible story. It is the very first feature film script for Liz Hannah. She wrote it without knowing if it would ever make the big screen, and then
3 months later, I got a call that Stephen, Tom, and Meryl were all reading it and that they were really thinking about doing it. So that was the best and most terrifying phone call I've ever gotten.
Can you imagine your very first feature film being made by Steven Spielberg and starring Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep? Make sure you subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts.
It was a different time and a different president, but the news that this president, Donald Trump, wanted to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller last June, only to be convinced it would be a political firestorm if he did, it certainly brings back echoes of what's become known as the Saturday Night Massacre. It erupted as the nation was in the throes of Watergate. Randy Kay tonight looks back.
I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years. Richard Nixon and White House counsel John Dean in secret recordings talking about the Watergate break-in. The special prosecutor, Archibald Cox, wants the tapes and subpoenas the White House for them.
That's the way they play it. That's the way we're going to play it.
But Nixon invokes executive privilege and refuses to give up the tapes. But the U.S. Court of Appeals steps in, ruling that Nixon must comply. Nixon instead tries to hand over summaries of the recordings, but Cox balks at the idea.
I think it is my duty to bring to the court's attention what seems to me to be non-compliance with the court's order.
Thinking he has the country on his side, Nixon takes a gamble and orders his Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, to fire Cox.
Good evening. There are reports tonight that President Nixon has ordered Attorney General Elliot Richardson to fire the special Watergate prosecutor Archibald Cox.
But the Attorney General refuses to fire Cox and resigns in protest.
I am committed to the independence of the special prosecutor. For me to have acquiesced in his being fired would be a total betrayal of that commitment.
So Nixon orders the Deputy Attorney General to fire the prosecutor. He, too, refuses and resigns. Before the night is done, though, the U.S. Solicitor General, suddenly filling in as Attorney General, agrees to fire Archibald Cox, the so-called Saturday Night Massacre. Still, Nixon is hardly immune to it all. About 9 months later, Nixon on the verge of impeachment. But instead of being removed from office, he resigns.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Randy Kaye, CNN, New York.
Well, we decided to assemble a group of people who were very involved in what was happening in and around the Nixon White House. David Gergen was then a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. John Dean was the president's White House counsel who eventually cooperated with investigators. Richard Benveniste, a lead attorney for the Watergate Special Prosecutor's Office. And last but certainly not least, Carl Bernstein, then a reporter for the Washington Post. Carl, along with Bob Woodward, would become journalistic legends by breaking story after story in the Post. David Gergen, I mean, you were working for President Nixon the night he ordered the firing of the special prosecutor. I'm wondering what went through your mind then and what went through your mind when you heard that President Trump had attempted essentially the same thing.
Well, Saturday Night Massacre was a shock. I must say, I almost drove off the road coming home from dinner because it literally was some of the best people in government were resigning en masse, and there was a very clear sense we were in crisis. No one knew where it was going to end, and that the Republic was in some danger. So it was a big deal. And when I heard about President Trump, it's so ironic in some ways, Anderson. This was one of the best days of his presidency here in Davos. He really helped himself with the European business leaders as well as American business leaders and thinking about being positive about the American economy. And along comes this story. And, you know, it's a complete drag on him. It overshadows Davos. But it is his fate until this is resolved. This is a story is a very dangerous one for him.
John Dean, you'd left the White House by the time of the Saturday Night Massacre. You were cooperating with investigators, but previously you were President Nixon's Don McGahn. You were his White House counsel. What do you make of McGahn reportedly preventing the firing of Mueller?
Well, the rules of ethics have changed considerably since Watergate because of Watergate. And one of the things a lawyer has to do today is if he sees a criminal activity going on, he has to withdraw from it or resign. And in some jurisdictions, that can be a noisy withdrawal. So he did what the rules would call for. But as it happened, Anderson, I had pled guilty just days before the Saturday Night Massacre. I had gambled. I'd been told that he might be fired. And I thought, well, there's no way he can do it without having to somebody else forcing him to appoint a new one. So I was willing to take the risk. And indeed, that's what happened.
Richard, you were working for Archibald Cox when Nixon not only fired him, but declared the special prosecutor's office disbanded. I'm wondering what kind of effect did that have on you, your colleagues, and how unnerved do you think the Mueller team is, if at all?
Well, it was a total emotional shock. Intellectually, we had the idea that this might happen. Indeed, John had just pled guilty the day before Judge Sirica. And he called me immediately after he heard the news and said, what do we do now? And Judge Sirica settled down. The grand jury called him in, said, you're still in business. the firing of Archibald Cox has not affected you. And we, to our amazement, dusted ourselves off because we were not fired along with Archibald Cox. But it was quite clearly an effort to obstruct justice by firing Archibald Cox, as the firing of Robert Mueller would be, because there's no legitimate basis to fire him. It's something we've discussed here on your show since June for sure, and perhaps that's had some effect on Don McGahn and others in the White House who tried to prevent and did succeed in preventing Trump from following his instinct to fire Robert Mueller.
Carl, I mean, the irony is, of course, the backlash against Nixon was so strong, he had to appoint a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, who was just as tenacious about getting the secret tapes. There's no reason to believe President Trump wouldn't face a similar backlash if he had fired Mueller.
Well, the big difference up until now in Watergate and what we're witnessing has been the Republicans who have come time and time again to Donald Trump's support as he tries to shut down this investigation by any means possible, to undermine it, to demean it. We've yet to hear Mitch McConnell or Paul Ryan get up and say, Mr. President, this Mueller investigation, which is legitimate and important to our country, must go on. What happened in Watergate was that Republicans became the heroes of Watergate by saying nobody, including the President of the United States, is above the law, Mr. Nixon. You must turn over your tapes. You must cooperate with the special prosecutor. And that's the big difference. And we have yet to hear from Republican leaders and say, Mr. Trump, we are not going to tether our party to your lying. And that's the other consistent element. The most consistent thing Trump has done in office is to fight for the Russian investigation to be made to go away one way or another. It's been loud. It's been consistent. He's tried to undermine it at every single turn. And now it appears that there is a serious obstruction case that the special prosecutor might be building.
I want to continue with our panel in just a moment. There's still a lot to discuss. We've got to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Back now with our Echoes of Watergate panel, John Dean, Richard Benveniste, David Gergen, Carl Bernstein. President Trump is denying any collusion, of course, with Russia and insists there was no obstruction of justice. So, Carl, I mean, this is a series of troubling decisions that are looming over the investigation.
The most important decision is what Mueller is going to do, and we don't know what he's going to do. It's clear that he has got the president's campaign, his closest associates, members of his family, in his sights. Now, it doesn't mean he wants to bring them down in his sights. He wants to find out what they have done. And they have been resisting letting him know what has been done and what they did.
You know, David, there's a passage in Carl's book, The Final Days, which he co-authored with Bob Woodward. At the height of Watergate, you were talking to Ben Stein, another speechwriter, who was working on a housing speech, and you said, quote, the moral authority of the president is collapsing. How can you be thinking about housing? To me, it's a really interesting question, and I'm wondering is that what it's like in a White House when all this stuff is going on? The challenge of trying to actually get work done amidst a potentially existential crisis, or at the very least, an overwhelming, a huge investigation.
Absolutely, Anderson. The White House staff, a lot of people around the president are very honest citizens. They've come in for what they hope is a good cause. And when something like this happens, you worry greatly about, are the pillars going to come down? I had that conversation with Bob Woodward on several occasions when he would call, and we were both concerned. Carl was concerned about that. We had lots of conversations inside the White House. Should you leave? Is the patriotic thing to do to leave this White House or not? And a number of people did leave quietly as they could. And I think that same thing is true here. Now, listen, I want to say a lot of supporters of the president are going to say, why are we talking about this Mueller story? This is the Saturday night massacre that never happened. So why is it important? Well, one reason it's important is that over the past few months, on almost a dozen occasions, the White House has told us there was never any consideration in the White House about firing Mueller. It's never been on the president's mind.
Right, Kellyanne Conway, Sarah Sanders,
true,
they've all been
lied
saying
to us
this.
consistently. Yeah, they've all been saying it. So if they've been lying to us on this, why are we to believe them on the collusion issue? Why are we to believe them on laundering? Why are we to believe them on these other things? That is so corrosive to the moral authority of the president, and it is threatening to democracy when you have a situation like that.
John, I know this may be weird, but if you could channel yourself back at the lowest days of Watergate when you were on tape talking with President Nixon about how to cover up the Watergate burglary, what would that, John Dean, advise President Trump to do with all of this? I mean, would you say, look, Mr. President, just play hardball, and if worse comes to worse, you can always try to pardon yourself? What would you say?
Well, initially when I started dealing with him and those recorded tapes show, I was trying to figure out who he was, where he was, what he knew, because for the first 8 months of Watergate, I had no dealings with him at all. And when I do start dealing with him on a daily basis, I'm not quite sure what he does know. I today know he knew much more than I did. And I very quickly tried to convince him that Watergate was a threat to him and that he had a cancer on his presidency. And if he didn't stop it, it might end his presidency. That's what surprised me is he had answers for every problem I raised. And that's when I thought I really knew who Richard Nixon was.
So your recommendation for the president this time?
My recommendation would be the sooner he gets this up and out and dealt with, the better for himself, the better for his presidency. And if indeed he has not colluded, as he says, if he's not obstructed, then why is he acting as he has? Nixon himself had not ordered the Watergate break-in. There's not a scintilla of evidence he knew about it in advance. Yet he was covering up, and initially we know from the tapes, because he was worried about his friend John Mitchell. Well, it looks like in this instance that Trump was worried about his friend General Flynn. Very similar kind of motives might come to play. So Trump should understand this history, should see the consequences of it, and try not to repeat it.
Richard, one of the great unresolved questions from Watergate was whether a sitting president could be indicted. Leon Jaworski, the second special prosecutor, wanted Congress to take the lead on whether or not to impeach. So are those who say indicting a sitting president would simply be too destabilizing for the country, and that's why the impeachment process exists. What do you say?
It's a question that has never been resolved. The Supreme Court has never opined on it. And we don't know whether what Robert Mueller will do with the information. In our case, we had a sitting Judiciary Committee which was considering impeachment. Here, to Carl's point, the Republicans who control both houses of Congress have not demonstrated an interest to the extent that is necessary, in my view, in protecting the nation by considering the import of what this investigation is all about.
I want to thank everybody on the panel. Fascinating stuff. Coming up, question is, where is Melania Trump? This week, the First Lady skipped going to Davos with the president, then made a surprise trip to Florida, keeping an even lower profile than usual. The question is she charting a new course for First Ladies or just trying to stay out of the spotlight? That's next. Well, as First Lady, Melania Trump certainly isn't as public as many of her predecessors, to put it mildly, and never has that been more evident than just this week. She was scheduled to travel to Davos with the president, but canceled that trip at the last minute. Yesterday, she left for West Palm Beach, Florida, and was back on the plane late today. Now, we don't know the reason for the trip. Of course, the elephant in the room is the news that recently broke about the president's reported payoff for an alleged affair with a porn star a few months after Melania Trump gave birth to their son. CNN contributor Kate Anderson Brower is the author of a book called First Women. Recently wrote an op-ed in the New York Times with the headline, The Quiet Radicalism of Melania Trump. And Kate joins me now. Kate, you write in your piece, quote, it may end up being Melania who winds up doing more than any of her predecessors to upend our expectations of the slavish devotion a First Lady must display. Can you just explain what you mean by that? And is that the radicalism that you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have this very archaic notion of what a first lady should do. First, there's no job description, there's no payment for the job, and there's endless criticism, right, no matter what you do. You saw that with Michelle Obama, Laura Bush, Hillary Clinton, and I think it's really unique that she isn't just sort of standing by her man in the way that we've seen even progressive women like Hillary Clinton do. And I think they're really the only other marriage that you could possibly even put in the ballpark of the Trump relationship. It's just very complicated. And I personally like the fact that she is not coming out vocally and supporting him and making it clear that she is upset about some of this. It's humiliating.
You think that's what her silence is? You think her silence is saying that?
I think so, and I think canceling the Davos trip on their 13th wedding anniversary, the inauguration tweet where she's with a Marine and not her husband, I think all these things add up. Not moving to the White House immediately was unprecedented. 5 months after he moved in, she moved in. And then, of course, the fact that they have separate bedrooms, they're the first presidential couple since the Kennedys to sleep in separate bedrooms in the White House. I think it says a lot.
It often takes first ladies a while to figure out what the kind of initiatives they want to have. I think even, Michelle Obama, it took her quite a while to kind of figure out exactly what she wanted to do. Is it possible that Melania Trump is simply in that phase right now?
I don't think so. I mean, they have far fewer staff than Michelle Obama had. It did take her about a year, to come up with the Let's Move campaign, which was Michelle Obama's signature issue in the White House. But I don't think that Melania Trump, wanted her husband to run. She's not political. And I think we just see that no matter what she does, like cyberbullying kind of backfired for her because of her husband's tweets. And there's almost nothing she can do that will be apolitical. And so I think people kind of feel badly for her a little bit.
Do you think she's interested in the role? I mean, you've written about other first ladies in the past.
I don't think that she is. I mean, she didn't grow up in this country. It's a hard role to understand even growing up here. And the first ladies I've talked to often have said how difficult it is. And they've reached out to each other, which I think is another key thing that Melania doesn't have. She hasn't spoken with Michelle Obama since they met a year ago, and she had lunch with Laura Bush shortly after the inauguration. But it's not as though she has warm relationships with any of these other women. And so I think she's in a particularly hard position.
Kate Anderson-Brower, thanks very much. More news ahead. We'll be right back. Quick programming note, you don't want to miss this. The Van Jones Show premieres tomorrow here on CNN. In the first episode, Van drives around in a van, yes, with Trump voters and Clinton voters in Charlottesville, Virginia.
What's up, Tanner?
You see it in live. I don't see any horns. I don't see any pitchforks.
Hey, see? Well, they're in the trunk. Hey, listen, they don't have good sense of CNN. They let anybody try.
Here we are at Lee Park.
When you see that statue shrouded there, how do you feel about that?
That statue was put up as a way of telling black and brown people, you go this far and no further.
Pastor, what do you base that statement on, that they were put there for that purpose? Because
history.
That's contrary to anything that I know.
How would you feel if you were a black man or a black woman having, you talk about generations of enslavement, of brutalization. How would you feel seeing a statue?
I don't think that as a white person, I will ever completely understand how a black person feels.
And he also has an exclusive interview with Jay-Z. Quite a first show. Tune in for the Van Jones Show tomorrow, 7 p.m. Eastern, right here on CNN. That's it for us. Thanks for watching 360. Time to hand it over to Chris Cuomo for Cuomo Prime Time.